Hello and welcome to the Sprint 72 review. This was a standard 2-week sprint, but this was the last sprint before the G branch was cut. So you'll see some interesting numbers coming up. Next slide, please. So as usual, I will go over the sprint stats. John will give us an update on the community, Harpreet on the classic UI, Chris K on the service UI, a tag team of Bronagh, Adam, and Rich on the providers, Dina and Drew on Automate, Gregg T on platform, Alberto on the API, and Chris on documentation. Next slide. All right, so as I mentioned, the Gaprindashvili branch was cut on Monday night or Tuesday morning, somewhere in the middle of the night. Just a review for everyone. There were new labels that were created, and I'm going to go over them here real quick. So if you have a pull request somewhere and you want it to be backported to Gaprindashvili, you put Gaprindashvili yes on the pull request. If you definitely don't want it to be backported, you put Gaprindashvili no. Then at some point we try to backport using some Git commands, and if that fails, then we label the pull request with Gaprindashvili conflict, and it goes back to the developer, make a branch-specific pull request. If the backporting succeeds, we label it as Gaprindashvili backported. So this is no different than anything else, than any of the other releases that we've done, just reviewing them here. The branch-specific PRs, so when a developer has to make one of those because of a conflict, when you make the pull request up in GitHub, there's a place to pick what the base is. Typically, it's master for everything you guys do. But for these branch-specific ones, you have to actually pick the Gaprindashvili branch. If you don't, you will get lots of commits in your pull request, and it will be all weird and wrong. The other thing is, when you make one of those, please link to the PR and master from which this thing was created from. Okay, so that's Gaprindashvili. Next slide, please. So the master is now base for the H release. There's a new architecture coming in H. Jason put together a nice blog post about it. There's a link up here. And John Prause is preparing the voting for naming the H release. So that will happen shortly. I don't remember when, but
this Monday.
Oh, there you go. So it's going to happen soon. And I guess so the master is now pointing at H, and we are starting now to stabilize the Gaprindashvili branch. That'll probably take us through the end of the year roughly, and we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it'll be nice and stable. Next slide. All right, so John created a new format here for visualizing the pull request merged across all the various repos. I think this one's a lot easier to see. So the ManageIQ repo in red and the classic UI repo in yellow, orange there, they roughly have the same number of pull requests merged. And then the other one was the integration tests that are going on, followed by the service UI. You get a feel for how the pull requests were spread out over the various repos. Next slide. All right. So we went through the roof here, obviously, in terms of number of pull requests closed compared to every other sprint that you see there. We also seem to have added another repository. We're up to 86 down at the bottom there, 72/86. So the number on the right there marks the number of repositories that are in the project. Yeah, I think this was a testament to everyone trying to finalize things for the Gaprindashvili branch before we actually made the branch. And I'm thinking that it'll probably go back to normal after this sprint, but we'll see. Next slide, please. So in terms of the types of pull requests that we had across all the various repos, we obviously had more enhancements than bug fixes. So 38% were enhancements, 28% were bug fixes, and the rest were sprinkled around with tech debt, refactoring, a lot of developer stuff as we're trying to kind of improve the life for developers a little bit. Nothing other of note here. Next slide, please. Right, and the health report on the various repositories that we track. There's a lot of green there, so that's awesome. Looks like the Hawkular repository had its GPA jump up dramatically. Didn't dig into that, whether that's because of changes in how the score is calculated or they actually fixed a number of issues. I'm hoping it's the latter. So it's mostly moving in the right direction, a lot of green, not too much red. So let's continue moving things, more and more green here. Next slide, please. Over to John.
Okay. For last week in ManageIQ, the blog entries, the first one was done by me. And this past week, Drew Ullman entered a crossword puzzle. And if you take a look at that, she's going to have a prize if you complete the whole puzzle, but you got to return the puzzle back to her. So I don't know what the prize is, but if it's cash, I'm going to cheat. The Find 4 release was also announced last week, and you can take a look at that link and see all about that. And we also had additional blog posts from Edgar Hernandez and Jillian Tullo, and that is a couple weeks ago we also had an additional 2 blog entries, so that's pretty cool to have people just contributing that way outside of last week in ManageIQ. And special thanks to David Halas for successfully being a help and a presence at the Open Source Summit in Prague. I almost said Prause because it's close to Prause. And that's it. Next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. So in this past sprint, total of 129 PRs were merged in Classic UI repo. Out of that, 39 were enhancements, 56 bug fixes, 30 technical debt, and 4 refactoring PRs. There were about 5 PRs merged in UI components repo. And some of the main refactoring and technical debt PRs are listed here. I'm not going to go over all of them. The major one that impacts a lot of screens in UI is that the where clauses were replaced with named scope. That impacts list views. And next slide, please.
Harpreet, how does it impact things? What should people expect?
There was in past sprint, there was a lot of GTL related errors that were popping up on the screen.
Okay, so that should address those, right?
Yes.
Excellent.
That should address a lot of those, and we are still working on fixing some of the other ones.
Excellent, thanks.
I want to thank Laura for preparing slides in my absence yesterday. And we have some of the major enhancements listed here. I have screenshots for some of them, so I'm not going to go over all of those. I'll skip first 5 and I'll talk over those with the screenshots. And one of the major things added was in the services list view, advanced search was added. And in the UI components repo, changes were made to how targeted auto refresh logic used to work. So now if a dialog field has a responder, that will be used to refresh the fields. If it's not there, then we rely on the old auto refresh logic code. The next enhancement was to add the ability for the user to add or remove security groups for a selected OpenStack instance. And in the Control Explorer, support was added to show middleware server compliance and control policies. Also, timelines was added to physical server summary screens. Next slide, please. So this past sprint, Aparna Karve has updated generic object class definition screen to have a tree view in the left side to make the navigation easier through the generic objects, classes, and definitions. And there was also support added to um, allow the user to add, delete, or update custom button groups in the same area. So as you can see in the screenshot, you can see the tree on the left side, and under there, there's actions folder that holds the custom button groups. Next slide, please. I think that one shows, yeah, so this is the CRUD for the custom button groups. Next slide, please. So to the reconfigure virtual machine screen, a new field was added, a drop-down for the controller type. So user is now able to select a controller type and pass in with the options. Next slide, please. There were some additional parameters were added to the Playbook Automate method screen, such as hosts, max TTL, and options for log output. Next screen, please. So in the Configuration Explorer under Settings Regions node, we moved all the tagging related tabs into one single tab. As you can see, the old one, we used to have My Company tags and import tags and map tags, all separate tags. Now, so in the new screenshot, you can see they were all moved as sub-tabs under a tags main tab to create some room on that screen to add a new tab. Next screen, please. So we have added this new tab here, Help Menu tab, that allows users to be able to customize items in the Help menu on the top right. And I think that's all for the classic UI. Next screen. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks. So two big additions to the service UI this release. The first one is we've added generic object support. So now you'll be able to view your generic objects within a service. Next slide, please. We've also, the other big addition is we've broken out the RBAC into a SUI specific RBAC. So now you'll have a lot finer grained control over the RBAC within the service UI, and makes it a little more clear for people to find what you're looking for. Next slide, please. And of course, we've had just a huge amount of various UI-related bug fixes, and we've done our normal dependency updates. Okay, that is it for the service UI. Next slide, please.
Okay, so for providers, Adam and I will share updates from the Nuage provider, OpenStack, Kubernetes, Popular, Rev, Lenovo, and VMware. And Rich will share updates on Smart Snake analysis. Next slide, please. So most merged pull requests this sprint came from Amazon, followed by Nuage, followed by Overt. And incidentally, the cloud providers team focused on bug fixes this sprint. Some merged pull requests from the Azure provider combined with the Azure AmRest gem come to 16. And the pie chart illustrates the number of pull requests from the rest of the providers. Next slide, please. So lots of enhancements this sprint on the Nuage provider. So add and edit a Nuage provider has been enabled in the UI. So this screenshot displays the edit provider screen. So for fallback purposes, the user can enter 3 different endpoints in order of priority. So should one host be inaccessible, the next host will be used. Next slide, please. So full event catcher support was added this sprint, which uses the AMQP messaging protocol. And targeted refresh was also implemented for network groups, security groups, and cloud subnets. So when an event is received for one of these types, only that inventory object type will be refreshed. Next slide, please. So here we have a demo provided by the Nuage team. So here we're looking at the summary screen for a Nuage network manager. We'll the security groups. We'll see we have 3 security groups. So next we'll flip over to the Nuage UI and we'll create a new security group called LEMI Policy. So this will fire an event which will be received by ManageIQ, which will trigger a targeted refresh of the new security group. So now we'll refresh the screen. We'll go back into security groups. And now you'll see that the count of security groups has increased from 3 to 4. And there we have the LEMI policy, second from the top. Hi, please. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Bronagh. So last sprint, the Lenovo team added the support for retrieving config patterns in inventory refresh, and this sprint they added the ability to apply a new config pattern to a physical server, which will let them actually do provisioning, probably coming up in the next sprint. They also added the ability to open a console directly to the provider, so from our UI you can open up the native provider UI, which is pretty cool. For VMware, as Harpreet showed, we can now control the type of SCSI controller that gets added. Before we were trying to interpret this from the previous SCSI controllers, but we can't always guarantee that's what the customer wanted, so it's always good to give them add this exact thing. So that was added this sprint. And OpenStack added UI notifications around a number of actions for VMs, cloud volumes, snapshots. They added targeted refresh for orchestration stacks and cloud tenants. And we can now provision from volumes and volume snapshots on OpenStack. Next slide. The Rev team added V2V mass transformation, so you can take VMs from VMware and convert them over to Rev on more than just a single VM at a time basis, so you can do it for a whole group of VMs. They added sysprep support for, I think, Windows templates, maybe more, but that was something that's been there in VMware for a long time, and now Rev can do that as well. And a number of fixes around open virtualization network, I think, Open Virtual Network support. There were some issues where it was opening connections directly to the provider from the UI workers, and so a number of those issues have been fixed. The middleware team added power operation events for EAP servers and some good per minute and hourly web metric reports. Next slide. The containers team added better error reporting for OpenSCAP failures, some chargeback reports based on pod limits, which was feedback from customers when they didn't want to have something from the spec. I forget exactly what it was coming from, but pod limits are what they wanted to see for the chargeback report. Prometheus alerts now show up at the ext management system level, and you can add and hide environmental variables from the Container Explorer. Next slide. One of the bigger features to land in this sprint was the inventory collector worker that uses the WatchPod API for Kubernetes. What this allows us to do is to get push updates from the provider as things change. The real issue here is with larger environments, refreshes can be on the order of hours, and pods get created and deleted on the order of minutes. And so it's entirely possible that we would completely miss the lifetime of a pod. And so by pushing updates from the provider as things get created, we can save it to the queue and they will eventually get created and noted. And so that fixed a pretty significant issue specifically around chargeback, because some pods that would need to be charged for would be completely missed by refresh. Next slide. And we have a short little demo.
Started?
Oh, that already started. So most of our environments were down, so we stole Federico's. Sorry, Federico. Yep, that one. So you can see there are 33 pods in this, and what I'm going to do is, so we see we initially get back all of the pods when you connect to the provider, so we have refresh for those 33 pods. What I'm going to go over here is scale up Federico's Docker registry, sorry again, to three replicas, which is invalid, so the pod will be created and immediately deleted. So you can see we immediately got a push update we got to create a number of updates. We queued those, and then it immediately got deleted. So this is all happening while a refresh is running. So the next time a refresh gets run, that pod will have already been deleted. So that gets pushed to the queue, and it will eventually get created. That's it. Next slide.
Okay. As I mentioned in the last sprint review, we were currently in the process of implementing smart state analysis for the Amazon environment, and I'm happy to say that initial implementation is complete, and we do have smart state analysis running end to end. Basically, there are three major parts of this. There's an agent that runs in the Amazon environment, and that's launched from a standard Atomic OS-based image. We then deploy our smart state specific code to that standard instance using Docker containers. Then there's an agent coordinator that runs in the appliance, and basically that deploys the agent, monitors the agent, and is responsible for the life cycle of those agents. In addition to that, there's an asynchronous response handler because basically we queue requests into the Amazon environment and they're handled by the agent. The responses can come back out of order. So the response handler we made asynchronous, and it could handle those requests as they're completed in any order. And it's responsible for reading the responses, syncing it to the database, and then updating the job status of the SSA jobs. And given that we actually have this running, I think it's a good time for a demo. So next slide, please. And Gary, we have put together a demo.
Let me just share my screen here.
It's a live demo, or it's recorded?
It's a recording.
It's recorded, but it's on my computer. Thank you, sir. What do I do without you? Just so I know, we replaced John Prause's content.
No.
Can I work? Take it. Oh, thank you.
Cool.
Ready to
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. So what we're going to go through here is adding a provider in Amazon and running Smart State on one of its instances. The reason we're actually going through and adding a provider is because we actually had to make changes to the UI to add a second set of credentials for conceivably for that Docker image. In some cases, we require Docker registry credentials. So we're adding the default credentials, and then you'll see there's a second tab here for Smart State Docker credentials, which are not required to be validated. And actually, these will be under control of a setting in the settings YAML file, which has not been implemented yet. So you will not see that in the future. So we're going to go, in all cases, upstream, for instance. We're going to go through, and we selected an instance. We're going to run Smart State on it. And there, we'll go check out the tasks table, and it hasn't been updated there yet. We're going to go out to the Amazon environment, and we're going to look for anything in the queue and anything in a bucket that has been created by this request. And as of yet, we don't see it. We're going really fast. Here you see that the process has started up, and you'll see the scan has started in the task table, and it actually says now scanning in the region. And if we refresh what we've got going here, in a second, you will see, yes, that the message has been queued up there. You've got one message in the request queue. And no additional bucket yet. The buckets we have there are from other regions, and here's the bucket for Ohio, which is what we just added. So when we click through that, we don't see any data yet because the job is still happening. There is our instance that's actually doing the scan. That top one, it says it's initializing. Once it initializes and installs all the smart state code, it will run the scan job. We click on the bucket, you'll actually see that stuff is running there. We've got an extract bucket there. And by the time I actually click through on this and look at the heartbeat, went back to the data queue that the job had already been updated. It's very quick. Let's see where we're going now. And once I refresh here, you'll see actually that there's a response message in flight there. And the status has already been updated here. The process is already completed. Go back to the instance itself. You'll see that the data has been updated for all the information about the instance itself. That's it.
Thanks, Sherry.
Stop sharing.
I'm done,
Clear.
so next slide. Who's next?
Okay. Yes, good morning. We had a great sprint this time, 45 PRs merged with the majority being enhancements. Expression methods was an enhancement recently made by Madhu, which is really kind of cool because expression methods in most cases can replace inline methods for dynamic dialogues. They're much simpler, they're much faster, they have very low overhead compared to inline methods. The only drawback is that they require object ID comparisons to uniquely identify objects. So by Madhu adding the supporting of IDs, that makes that feature complete, which is awesome. So people should look at that to replace their dynamic dialogue in inline methods. Orchestration service provisioning. Most service provisioning use a state machine that has an automated method called catalog item initialization. That method is responsible for applying dialogue tags. Orchestration service provisioning doesn't use that state machine, so tags were basically ignored. A change was made to add the tag application on the back end, so now it's feature complete. Lucy recently added the initiator, added user group and tenant IDs for the initiator to event streams, which means that, and previously the events only had like VM owners and they didn't have the initiator context. Now events, when they call into automate, will use the initiator context when available. Next slide, please. As mentioned before, V2V transform tag support was added, which allows you to specify a category tag for mass transformation. OpenStack reconfigure was added for the automation auto approval workflow, and also has content changes that allow you to do manual approval. The ability to remove from VMDB for host was added to automate, and a new customization tab was added for Google provisioning. Next slide, please. Eric introduced targeted auto refresh, which basically lets, as Harpreet mentioned earlier, that if the how does it work? Auto refresh, which will use field responders if available, as opposed to the old auto refresh. Several changes were made, as Harpreet mentioned, for the UI changes for Ansible playbook methods. 3 new changes, which are pretty cool, is that you have the ability to select the level of playbook output you want on a method-by-method basis, which is kind of nice because you can do always, never, and on error. So you could do it always initially as you debug it, and then you could turn it down to never or whatever. I believe the default is on error. Execution time, time to live is a feature that's currently supported in Ansible Playbook services. We've added that to the Ansible Playbook method, which allows you to indicate the amount of time you expect the playbook to take to finish, and then it sets up a retry interval divided by the max retries. Now, this is only available for state machines, so that value will be ignored if the method is running not in a state machine context. And a host option was added, which allows you to specify local host or specific host values, and this is kind of cool because it allows you to use substitution, which is really kind of cool. And finally, Madhu continued his work on the Automate Workspace by adding encryption and decryption for the workspace via API. Next slide, please, and over to Joe.
Thanks, Tina. So in regards to the Automate Workspace, we spent time during this sprint, actually it was a number of sprints, building out a module for use by Ansible that we can let us manipulate that workspace via playbook. It's currently not part of Ansible, so while we're working through that process, it's available on Galaxy. So I have the Galaxy URL there, and then also the GitHub one is actually where the repo that Galaxy points to. We named the module ManageIQ Automate, and there's lots of examples on the Galaxy page for the role, but so I'll let you modify and do all kinds of things. But the small subset is you can basically get and set attributes on an object, get and set state vars, and set state machine retries. We're also adding to it as we move forward here, so the behavior will increase. On the next slide, I'll actually be showing a sample of something that we kind of call siphon method parameters. And basically, it allows us to grab all the method parameters within the workspace and then apply them as attributes on an object. So here is just a small set of tasks on a playbook that use the new module. You can see there's a line, basically an argument called workspace. And in that case, for each call or method call to the module, we pass in a current version of the workspace. On the first task here, we're grabbing all the method parameters. We register the output to a variable called method params. And then on the second task, we basically loop through all those attributes and apply them to an object underneath the variable called object. And essentially, that's just 2 calls to a module where it would have been many multiple plays with multiple arguments before for a playbook. And then as the third task here was just a quick example as to how to set a retry for a state machine. And really all you have to do is call the set retry method there and pass it an interval. And that is it. Next slide, please.
That's me. Thanks, Drew. So on the platform side, it was a good sprint. We had lots of enhancements, lots of bug fixes there. If you recall last sprint review, I mentioned that we had added metering to the chargeback reports, and I said we were going to promptly pull them out. So that's what we did, and we created a new type of report called metering reports. And basically, this is like chargeback, but it doesn't do, it has nothing to do with rates or cost calculation. It's just a meter of the running hours for a period, for an instance, and the existence hours, like in the case, like for a VM, if it existed the entire time of the period, then it would just be the full period. But if it was actually created during that period and retired, it would take that into account too. By the way, chargeback also does that as well when we do calculations now. And in addition to those things, you can have metrics on those reports like you do with chargeback. And later on, I'll have a screenshot of that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so on the chargeback side, the first bullet there is support for charging by dynamic cloud storage types. This is something that started a long time ago, actually by Shimon, who's not on our team anymore, and then finished up by Libor. This was a big RFE that people have been asking for, and I'll show a screenshot of that too. So, but basically, you can the things that we have now in rate definitions are all fixed things, and these are additional storage things that we can pick up dynamically, the types of storage, and set rates on those separately, and then charge for those separately as well. And now we have Chargio, affectionately named after Sergio, who's the champion of chargeback in the VU, but he's also a developer, and you'll see I gave him credit for the work that he and Alberto have done. Alberto was a community member, and now he's working for Red Hat, working on chargeback, and I think on the middleware team. Not the rest, Alberto. So right now, we kind of did a bit of like a hackathon here a month or so ago, probably longer than that. And we did the initial integration to basically integrate this new chargeback backend with the current existing chargeback so that we can support the existing reports and rates and those things, but do the calculations and rate selection with the new backend. And this is the first step towards moving completely over to this new chargeback. It's going to give us just a tremendous amount of flexibility on how we charge and what we charge against as well. So stay tuned for that. We'll be working towards that in the next release. And those are the names of all the people that are involved in that integration. And right now it's just a prototype. We're using a setting to turn it on. But as we move that forward, more of that will be integrated into chargeback that you see today.
Is it on by default or off by default?
It is off by default. Next slide, please.
Printashvili, but probably will be on in master or something.
Yeah. And maybe it'll be different because it hopefully will have gone much further with the integration and be more on the new one where that'll just be the chargeback.
It would be good if in the future sprint review there was an actual presentation of what this new chargeback system is and why it's more flexible.
Yep.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, we should do that. Okay, some additional enhancements. So we made an enhancement to show the amount of quota used on the tenant quota screen where you configure quotas for cases where you don't have a quota defined for a particular tenant. So basically, if there was no quota defined, we wouldn't show any usage. So we updated that so you could see the usage, and I'm sure that's helpful when you're defining quotas as well. And Nick updated the database backup to use PG-based backup instead of PG dump, so that we can make sure we include the embedded Ansible database in addition to the VMDB database. And actually, it's nice because base backup backs up everything, like it's the whole data directory. So he's updated the backup and the restore to use that. And now you can, if you have embedded Ansible enabled, the backup and restores will work. That's a big change. And Joe V added the Cloud.net support for Google Compute. I think you guys referred to on the Automate slides. And I will have something in the next sprint, some screenshots of this new PG Inspector, which is a tool for diagnosing database locks. This is actually came out of some fairly painful issues we've had in the past, where we've had environments where things were deadlocked and nothing's running. So one of the keys to this tool is that even in a degraded state or even non-working state, we should still be able to get enough information to do proper diagnosis. And this is basically a project that our intern Bo Yao did this summer, and he finished it up for this release and got all the pieces in. It's really nice, and basically you'll get like a map of the locks and who's holding the locks and who's waiting for the locks. But in addition to that, you can get sort of a map of the environment too, like what zones, which servers are in the zones, which workers are attached to which servers, and that would all correspond to what's in the lock graph. We're going to actually test this thing out in the next sprint against the big MBU lab and see it with real environment where you have lots of servers and connections and see what that looks like, and we'll take some screenshots of that.
Awesome.
All right, next slide, please. Okay, and I'm going to turn it over to Alberto for not the rest.
Thanks, Greg. Yep, so we've been going full steam ahead to provide the config map generator for the G release. So what essentially that does is simplify the configuration of external authentication for the part-applied ManageIQ. It's a new capability, compared to the current appliance external auth. Other than IPA, everything is pretty much manually configured. But for the pods, we provide this config map generator. It's a gem. It's its own container image that you can download and run. But essentially, you run a CLI there that configures external authentication, and it creates these auth config maps for the HTTPD pod. So you take those, apply them to the HTTPD pod, and redeploy it, and you basically have external auth enabled. So which is pretty cool. So we support all the external authentication we currently do with the appliance, Active Directory, IPA. Thanks to Jovi, we also added LDAP support there, and of course SAML. So we're in good shape there. There's a README there in the repo, how to deploy it, how to configure it, how to run it. So that's the config map generator. Back to you, Greg.
Thank you, Alberto. Okay, and then some significant bug fixes. There was an issue with widget generation in the global region where we had like a mismatch of group IDs from the lower region getting assigned to a widget that was created in the global region and basically prevented users in the group from seeing it. So Jillian made a fix for that actually just a couple of days ago. And Libor made a fix to chargeback reporting. I'm surprised that this one didn't come up sooner, but we weren't picking up VMs from subtenants in the chargeback reports. We made that fix. And a fix to the synchronization of cloud tenants to ManageIQ tenants, where we'd get out of sync in some cases, and we'd have existing cloud tenants that we had previously created. Trying to create them again, and the validation would fail, and it would actually break that synchronization. I think that's at the end of a refresh, and that would kill a refresh. We made a fix. That's a significant fix, obviously, to that one. Next slide, please. So here's a sampling of the new metering reports, and you can see on the top right there, that's where you select what you're basing the report on, and now you have metering for container images, container projects, and VMs. And I just ran a sample of what it looks like for a VM metering VM report, and you can see the hours of existence. In most cases, that's going to be the hours in the interval. In this case, it's a month. So the month of June had 720 hours, and July 744. And then the hours used, which is really just a count of metrics. So for each hourly metric that we have, that's the hours used, because the thing presumed to be on in that case. And I don't have it here, but there'd be cases where if the VM was created during the period, then you would see a smaller amount of time for the existence. All right, next slide. Probably a little hard to see, but this is a sample of the new dynamic chargeback reporting by storage types. So you can see that in the field selection on the top there, there's additional storage allocated columns that you can select from, like that GP2 and standard, and then unclassified metrics. And then you could see them as separate columns on the report. And I should have gotten a screenshot of the rates screen as well, where you can apply the rates to those types. That would have been interesting to see too, but you can do that as well. Okay, next slide. And this is just a sample of what the new, the change to the tenant quota screen looks like, where you see the usage, the in-use amount for those quotas that are not defined for a particular tenant. And I think that's it for the platform. And then Alberto again for the API.
For the rest.
Yes, give your rest.
Alrighty. So in this sprint, we have a couple of enhancements coming in the API. First one, previously we had the custom button sets, but now Aparna added the custom buttons itself. We have the new primary collection, API custom buttons, and as you can see, the full set of CRUD support. So the fetchers on the collection, the resources, the options, the creation of the custom buttons, and the standard edits and delete signatures. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have one enhancement from 2 main. This was exposing the security groups as a sub-collection for instances. So you have the fetchers getting the security groups off of instances as a sub-collection, the resources, as well as two actions for them to be able to add and remove security groups for instances. So that can be done by doing a single, as you see the first post signature, or you can do that in bulk for adding multiple in one call. And same thing with the remove of security groups. Next slide, please. Okay, one enhancement from Jillian. So we needed to expose the container nodes. So that's a primary collection. Standard collection get, resource get, and as well as the bulk query action that we support. Next slide, please. Okay, so new enhancement that was mentioned before from Adu. So we needed the ability to encrypt and decrypt passwords in the Automate workspace. So that comes in on the URLs directly for the Automate workspace by GUID, and we have the encrypt and decrypt actions, targeting a specific object and attributes in the live Automate workspace. And next slide, please. Okay, another enhancement by Madhu. We needed the ability to update request tasks. And that's essentially providing the edit action to the sub collection, the sub resource. And he made that available for automation requests, provision requests, as well as the standard MIQ request. Next slide, please. Okay, so one big enhancement from Tim. We now enable paging for all queries. So that kind of protects us from just hanging out there and dying. So the good thing here is that it's automatic. There's a API settings that you'll find API max results per page. So if your collection actually has less than that, you won't notice anything different. But if you have more than 1,000, you'll see in the paging links the next link. So as you fetch things now, you'll see, oh, I have more to fetch. So you'll just go on and fetch the rest. So, and there's a talk article. There's a link for that on the bottom. No pun intended. Next slide, please. And last but not least, so with the G release that was cut, the API version has gone to v3.0.0, and we've updated master for the H release. As you can see, we're jumping as far as Semver up to 4.0, so we know we have some incompatibility changes coming in, removing some deprecated functions, so we're jumping to 4.0 pre for H release master. And that's it for the API.
Hi, for documentation in this sprint, we've had a total of 19 PRs merged, 15 of which were enhancements, 4 were bugs. Highlights for those are we updated procedures on creating alerts, and we made some changes to generic objects to refer to dynamic resource objects. We added CRUD procedures for dynamic resource objects, procedure on publishing VM as a template, and enhancements to enabling Ansible server roles and best practices for network ID. Next slide, please.
All right. So with that brings the Sprint 72 review to a conclusion. I want to thank everybody for making this sprint be have the most PRs in a long, long time, and for helping us get to the G release. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.